Hello, I am Chandu Nair, handling the course on marketing management. Today we will be talking about organizational buying behavior. Many of us are used to consumers as buyers, but organizations too are buyers and their behavior tends to be quite different. So here's what we'll cover in this chapter. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what exactly is an organizational or business to business market. What are the differences between an individual consumer and an organizational buyer? What are the various buying centers within an organization and their respective roles? The organizational buying situations typically that occur, and the influences that one can play on organizational buying decisions, and finally, the organizational decision making process with respect to buying. So that's quite a fair bit, and let's get started. Now, why do organizations buy? Typically, organizations buy because they have to achieve some other goal in mind. Please understand that organizations exist to produce goods or provide services. That's their final aim. Of course, the final aim is to make money and make a profit. But in the process, therefore, they have to produce goods and services. So organized buying, organizational buying, therefore, is the decision-making process by which organizations tend to look at various options and get the information required to make choices, identify criteria, and finally end up choosing various alternatives, whether they are suppliers of products or services. Why do organizations buy? That's a very important question. Organizations buy a whole variety of things. They buy equipment, they buy plants, they buy buildings, they buy services, they buy various kinds of products. And many of these are indirectly or directly linked to their purchase and the economy's purchases of various goods and services. For example, if you take something as simple as ice cream, when you and I buy an ice cream, we just look at the flavor of the ice cream, the brand, the packaging, or whatever else. But for the company which manufactures the ice cream, there's a whole lot of things that he has to consider. Where is he going to buy the packing material from? There's a basic packing material, there's a secondary packing material. Who will transport the goods? Through whom will he sell it? Where does he get the equipment to make these things from? How does he keep it in cold storage? So as you can make out, even a simple product like ice cream has several other products and services woven around it. Let's take a few examples. You'll find there are different kinds of organizations and different kinds of buying situations. Let's take a few examples here. If you take somebody who manufactures even what today one might consider a consumer product like a car, you will find that somebody like Maruti Suzuki would buy things like steering wheels from a company like Sona Steering. Somebody like Tata Timken, who supplies bearings, would supply to Alstom Motors, who in turn would supply to somebody like Cummins Engineering. If you take healthcare, Apollo Hospitals is a major hospital group in the country. Somebody like Johnson & Johnson supply a variety of accessories, example surgical staplers, to Apollo Hospitals. Information and entertainment. Now Sony Entertainment, Sony Television, would decide whether the signals for Sony Max should be given to a particular provider, in this case Bhaskar Television, for distribution of cable and satellite television signals in Indore, and so on and so forth. There's a whole bunch of examples. You look at what is happening around you. Look at your own college, your institutions, where you worked, where you might have studied, and so on and so forth. And you'll find even schools tend to be in some way organizational buyers, so too colleges. See what all are these schools and colleges doing with respect to equipment, with respect to furniture, with respect to books, and see exactly how it differs from how you would buy many products. Therefore, if you look at business markets, organizational markets, business to business markets, they're quite different. For one, the competition tends to be more global. Not that in consumer products it's not global, but it tends to be far more global. You also need to be having some expertise in buying, unlike a consumer who can do a whole bunch of things, but you need to have some expertise in buying. It also tends to be geographically concentrated. Example, you find auto clusters in and around places like Chennai or Pune or Delhi, Gurgaon. So you find that there's a lot of concentration in certain regions. You also have relatively few customers. For example, if you take something like trucks, it's very difficult to go beyond 3-4 names in India like Telco or Ashok Leyland or Volvo. very difficult to think beyond a few names like these. And in the case of organizational markets, you will find there is a preference for directly buying from the supplier, and sometimes through very large intermediaries. But the presence of too many retailers and other kinds of intermediaries is smaller. And finally, it's very relationship oriented, because once you get in, for example, we saw Sona Steering supplying steering wheels. It's not that today Maruti can buy steering wheel from Sona and tomorrow it says, you know, bye bye to Sona, and it looks at somebody else. It's not like that. So there's a focus on building and maintaining a relationship. Now let's take a look at the types of organizational consumers. Most companies who are in the business to business markets don't produce products, you know, which finally go to a consumer or an individual consumer. They usually make products and services which go to another organization. So if you take somebody like a marketer here, what does he do? He gets some inputs, puts them through various processes, let's call them business processes in short, gets a final product. That final product actually goes into the business process of another organization. It becomes the input for another business customer, who again has various processes and gets an end product. That end product is either sold directly to an end consumer or again goes through intermediaries and other value added organizations. Companies, for example, who might do repackaging or, you know, break it up into smaller parcels or do other things with that product and then send it to the end consumer. So as you can make out, in a business to business market situation, there are various companies who make things for other companies, and there is a whole lot of churn before it finally reaches the end consumer. Let's take a look right now at the difference between consumer and industrial markets, and let's take a look at it based on various decision variables. If you were to take first and foremost something like appeal, if you were to look at an individual customer, the appeal needs to be a little more dramatic, whereas for an organizational customer you have to be much more rational, more logical, you know, which is what the second point is. The platform has to be approaching logic, the mind rather than the heart, whereas for the individual customer it's mostly emotional, appealing to the heart. So there you have it. The core difference first and foremost is one is more mental, the other is more emotional. The third thing is with respect to the brand. Yes, it's important to have credibility as a company, as an organization, as a brand, but the excitement or the things that drive an individual customer is really not so desired in this particular instance, whereas in the case of consumer marketing, it's virtually an imperative. How many of us would rather today perhaps choose an Apple iPhone as opposed to maybe some Chinese unknown brand? Very few, I would reckon, if you had the money to pay for it, of course. In terms of below the line activity or sales promotions, well, in the case of organizational marketing, by and large, there's very little of such below the line activity. On the other hand, sales promotions are a very common and necessary phenomenon in consumer markets. Likewise, in terms of brand personality, usually it tends to be more corporate in orientation, whereas in the case of consumer markets, it tends to be credibility as a company on the first hand, but also necessary for the product itself to have a personality. Good case again is iPhone and Apple Corporation, which makes the iPhone. Similarly, in terms of pre-launch research, well, there are different schools of thought. Some people believe it's vital to have a lot more research in the case of consumer markets, but increasingly some people, while it's not so vital in their business to business markets, is becoming a good differentiator. Distribution is far more widespread in consumer markets and pretty narrow in industrial markets. Similarly, the number of orders might be much smaller in the business to business market space, whereas for consumer markets, take toothpaste for example, it would be much larger because you buy them virtually every month or even more than once a month. Whereas those who are supplying tubes to toothpaste manufacturers like say Colgate Palmolive would not have so many customers to buy toothpaste tubes from them like SL Packaging. But the size of the order would be huger, as one can imagine, because there are so fewer customers. And finally, the cost of order processing is much lower in the case of business to business markets as opposed to consumer markets. There are many other differences as well. For example, there could be differences in the sales order and cycle time to get an order. You know, it could be much larger in business to business markets as opposed to consumer markets.